So I'm just going to give you a flavour of some of the insights contained in the interviews on our Ministers Reflect site. And I'm just going to focus on what ministers said about their experience of entering office, of getting things done and delivering real change on the ground, and the top tips they shared with us on ministerial effectiveness. If you go on the archive, you'll see a wealth of other information. These are sort of themes just focusing on today. So in terms of their experience of entering office, the vast majority of our interviewees were appointed in 2010 and faced a particularly challenging set of circumstances. It was, of course, the first coalition government in 70 years, which meant that posts weren't exactly allocated in quite the way parties had planned. Obviously, manifestos were also translated into the coalition agreement, which led to some initial confusion about what that meant for the future policy priorities that had been developed in opposition. As Mark put it, it took some time to refocus on what they were actually supposed to deliver in government. In the context of a tough austerity agenda, in those early days, weeks and months of being in office, ministers also had to make some quite tough judgment calls on how to allocate spending cuts. So Hugh Robertson, who was the former Olympics minister, for instance, remembered that on his very first day in the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, he went into the Secretary of State's office and sat down with the ministerial team, and they went through a list of 40 projects that were due to be funded with a red pen, one by one, knowing they could only keep about 5. Obviously, for some ministers who hadn't even shadowed their brief in opposition, those sort of judgment calls were particularly tough when they weren't that familiar with some of the department's activities. And finally, there was, after 13 years of Labour governments, there was little collective knowledge on what being a minister was like. You had obviously some familiar faces, Ken Clarke, some Andrew Mitchell, who had had junior ministerial roles, but the vast majority of MPs hadn't served in government before. In terms of their feelings towards their preparation for the role, I mean, it's always difficult to prepare for the realities of office, everything from the avalanche of work that hits you on your first day to the reality of being scrutinised on a round-the-clock basis. But some ministers did feel far better placed than others. Their previous experience, when it comes as a big surprise, was key to that. And we found the sort of 3 key variables that came through from the interviews. One was whether ministers had worked in a large organisation before coming into politics. And particularly in instances where they had run large organisations, they felt really quite comfortable with a departmental role. Secondly, whether ministers had any previous experience of working in departments. So we did speak to some who had been civil servants and had worked with ministers and had a good understanding of what that role entailed and saw some good role models. Obviously others had been junior ministers under the Heath, Thatcher and major governments, and again were more familiar with that role. And finally, the sort of third variable was whether they had shadowed their ministerial brief in opposition. As Chris Huhne put it, if you were to get thrown into any complex departmental area without having some previous period of absorbing the issues, you're at an enormous disadvantage. And many spoke to us about the challenges of getting up to speed on sort of complex subject matter. In terms of the actual induction period itself, experiences were similarly varied. Many found the appointment process a little chaotic. That ranged everything from Lord McNally finding out about his appointment on Sky News about 10 minutes before he actually received the phone call to confirm it was true. Others who, even after the phone call with David Cameron or Nick Clegg, were still none the wiser as to precisely what their role was or their ministerial brief. And there were others, so Bob Neal, Joe Swinson, who physically couldn't get access to their departments for one and in some cases several days because the necessary paperwork hadn't been completed. So sort of after these initial teething problems, most people found their private offices were their main source of induction support. So as a pensions minister, Steve Webb, pointed out, he was very honest, they didn't have a clue how government and civil service worked. And it was really his private office that gave the necessary briefings and the practical and emotional support that he needed in terms of hitting the ground running. And finally, when we asked ministers whether they thought there should be more formal induction, mentoring and training, their views were quite mixed. So everything from Andrew Mitchell, who saw any more formalised process as being another tier of bureaucracy that wouldn't be suitably personalised for individual ministers, to others such as Damien Green, who felt that politicians actually would benefit from a much more professionalised approach to induction and continuing development. And that was certainly echoed in interviews we did with ministers who were new to government altogether. So So moving on to the experience of actually getting things done. Obviously, for the first priority for most ministers was establishing an effective daily routine. The first few months in office, they were acutely aware those first 100 days that we often hear quoted in the media were critical for them, sort of establishing credibility, setting the right tone, getting key relationships forged. Again, the private offices were quite crucial in that, but ministers did emphasise to us the real need to assert control over their diaries, that habit of diary secretaries to schedule never-ending conveyor belt of meetings. And if they really wanted to focus on priorities, they needed some thinking time and space to engage with the right people. They also felt the real need to invest early in giving very clear directions to civil servants and how they wanted information presented to them. Departments often had quite established ways of working, but they really wanted them to adapt to their particular working style. But ministers also highlighted a number of obstacles that they faced in the early days to setting an effective routine. One of the big ones we heard was high civil service turnover. So some ministers went into office to find almost their entire private office had disappeared, and within a couple of weeks they were the most experienced person around them. They also found within the department more widely some key positions were left vacant when they came into office, and that particularly where they faced crises in the early days and months, they really felt unsupported. So Caroline Spellman, reflecting on her experience of the Forest sell-off fiasco, said, "We were without a permanent secretary, a head of news and a director of communications throughout the whole period, and that was really hard." And so she's quite critical of the lack of succession planning that we sometimes see in the civil service. And her comments are by no means isolated. You'll see other examples of that on the archive. A second issue, an obstacle that ministers highlighted, was the lack of understanding of Parliament among civil servants. Now, they very much conceded that within Parliament there's often a lack of understanding of civil service processes and machinery, but they were somewhat surprised at the lack of technical knowledge of how Parliament works, even within parliamentary units within departments. And some went to extra lengths to do briefing sessions for civil servants to try and build up that understanding. And they also highlighted the lack of political awareness sometimes. So a lot of the briefings that they received as preparation for debates in Parliament lacked of political astuteness. In terms of delivering results over their whole term in office, we asked ministers what was particularly helpful. And we heard that establishing and communicating clear priorities was essential to hitting the ground running, that civil servants needed a clear steer, and once they had that, they were remarkably adept at delivering for ministers. But ministers did also concede that it was important to stress test many of these policy priorities and enable effective challenge. So particularly in those early days and weeks when trusted relations with the civil service had yet to be forged, that challenge wasn't always forthcoming. So giving really explicit permission to civil servants that they welcome challenge, but also, as Steve Webb commented, going outside and finding external challenge, whether that was through going to conferences, establishing working groups with external stakeholders. Tim Loughton also really emphasised how he benefited from setting up groups of service users, for example, children in care, and getting that feedback and challenge on his policy ideas and as the policy went forward to be implemented. And we also heard from ministers recognise the need to proactively engage the centre. Now, that ranged everything from David Willetts's observations that he was able to help protect the science budget by having good relationship with the Treasury, independently of the negotiations that were going on with his department in the Treasury. We also heard a lot of people reflect on relationships with Number 10 and how they would have benefited from keeping Number 10 informed much earlier, particularly in controversial policy areas. As George Young pointed out, let Number 10 know if something's going wrong. They don't like being caught on the hop. And you're much, much more likely, many ministers reflected, the ones that did have policies that blew up on them later down the road, that had they have had the backing of Number 10 earlier on, the chances are they'd have had their back when things went wrong. We also asked about the key relationships in terms of delivering on the ground. As well as the private office, a number of other ones stood out. Firstly, the need for a well-functioning ministerial team. And most ministers characterised that as one where secretaries of state saw themselves as a team leader, maintain constant dialogue, particularly through face-to-face meetings. We heard stories of sometimes when ministerial teams very rarely met, and it certainly wasn't sort of a positive in terms of getting results on the ground. And also secretaries of state who are willing to delegate responsibility on the basis of earned authority. And as Alan Duncan put it, a good Secretary of State will bring out the best of their ministers and enjoy their success. A poor one will be a control freak who sometimes hogs everything for themselves. And we certainly saw from the interviews that junior ministers could be a real asset in delivering key policies, providing they demonstrated and established enough trust, because ultimately they had more time to oversee implementation than Secretaries of State had. The other key relationship that many ministers brought up was special advisors. And on both sides of the coalition, they were very honest in how sceptical they were about the value of special advisors coming into office, and how they did a real U-turn, having sort of experience working alongside them. And many felt, particularly junior ministers, that they would have benefited from having them. As Vince Cable said, I was a bit sceptical of special advisors, but having been in government, they're absolutely essential. They acted as an interface with the political parties, with other government departments, and with your political opposite number. Now, it's not to say that you won't find on our archive examples where ministers actually found particular special advisors blocked access to secretaries of state or created a more corrosive atmosphere. But overwhelmingly, the general response we had was that they added hugely to the support system and delivery. So I'm just going to leave you now with the top tips that ministers gave us on how to be effective in office. So we specifically asked them the question of what advice you would give to a new minister coming into office for the first time. And we sort of collated those results from the interviews that we've conducted so far. And overwhelmingly, number one was that need to have a clear set of priorities that are effectively communicated and relentlessly pursued. So as Simon Hughes points out, knowing your priorities, having enough control over your own agenda to be able to pursue them, and making sure then they don't get hijacked by others. Secondly was the need to invest in relationships with parliamentary colleagues. And one of the greatest regrets ministers shared with us was that they didn't feel they spent enough time in Parliament communicating with their colleagues, letting them know what they were doing, and they felt that ultimately that was sort of detrimental to the development of their career in the longer term. As Mark Hoban reflected, I probably spent less time doing that than I should have done. Another element of that was people felt that they should have invested more time in preparing for debates, putting time into parliamentary questions, so making a good impression amongst their colleagues. Thirdly, people were very honest. The reality of today's media scrutiny is that your public image matters. As Mark Priss put it, you have to push other things out of the way to spend enough time with the media, whether we like it or not. That's part of the process. People need to know what you're doing. And number 4 was the advice that you take advice from your predecessors. So it was everything from George Young's comments about finding out where the bodies are buried to who key stakeholders are that you should be engaging with. As Joe Swinson put it, you really shouldn't be afraid of whatever party affiliation your predecessors have. So she received lots of support from Labour, former Labour ministers who were very willing and open to share advice with her. And number 5 was take staff engagement and people management seriously. So many ministers will get quite distracted for understandable reasons by flagship policy priorities or media work or the many other sort of competing demands on their time. But recognising that civil servants are some of the most valuable assets to delivering on your policies, and that staff engagement, staff morale within departments needs to be taken seriously. And finally, the need to stay on top of your brief. So as Lord Howe put it, you've got to have the mind of a barrister or a super journalist, being able to leap from issue to issue and keep a lot of facts and figures in your heads and things and see things coming, so that continual ability to perform both in media, Parliament, and answer questions when your brief is constantly changing was something that new ministers needed to be aware of.